Today I'd like to discuss the flow of energy in ecosystems, and then as much as possible really look at the Yellowstone ecosystem and the flow of energy through that ecosystem. So when we talk energetics in ecosystems, we really need to first address the laws of energy. There are two major laws of energy. The first law of energy, and the first law of energy states that energy is neither created nor destroyed in chemical reactions. It certainly changes form. It can change from chemical energy to heat energy and kinetic energy and so on, but it's, again, neither created nor destroyed in chemical reactions. And then the second law of energy is that as energy flows through a system, and again, this could be through electricity through wires, or it could be as it flows from organism to organism in an ecosystem. But as energy flows through a system of any kind, some of the energy is lost from that system. So you can never have complete recycling of energy because energy, quote unquote, dissipates. High energy level energy, high quality energy degrades to low quality energy. There are a lot of ways to define the second law of energy, but basically it is that as energy flows or as energy changes form, some energy is lost from the system. So again, when we look at ecosystems then, one of the realities is that the atoms and molecules of life, those get recycled in food chains and the food web, which we'll be talking about later. So particles are recycled in nature over and over and over again. The atoms and molecules you're composed of are as old as the Earth itself. But since energy cannot be recycled in the same form repeatedly, energy flows through ecosystems. And so, again, this is a very fundamental concept to ecosystem function, and it's an important one to keep in mind as we continue our discussion. All right, another thing I want to discuss briefly is the unit of energy. So the calorie is the primary, or at least one unit that we use to describe energy, and the one that I'll be referring to mostly in this course. And so it's a unit of heat energy, actually. And a calorie is actually the energy required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius in temperature. And we actually normally use kilocalorie, and so a kilocalorie would be 1,000 of these calories. So on packaging, food packaging, and you'll usually see the word calorie there, but that actually is referring to a kilocalorie. So and when I talk about energetics, I'll be referring to kilocalories. So kilocalorie is a unit of heat energy. Now the primary source of chemical energy for enzymes in organisms is a molecule called ATP. So ATP is a really important molecule. And ATP, again, is significant because not all energy is usable energy. If we want to live, we need chemical energy. We need it in the chemical bonds of ATP. And the name comes from ATP, adenosine triphosphate. You can see that there are actually 3 phosphates here, 3 phosphate groups. And so anyway, when an enzyme has work to do that requires energy, it can't use electrical energy, it can't use other forms of energy, it needs energy from ATP. So this energy is released in what's known as an exergonic reaction. So when you combine ATP with water, when you do a hydrolysis reaction, you may recall that hydrolysis reaction breaks bonds. That will leave you with an ADP, adenosine diphosphate, instead of adenosine triphosphate. It will cause the release of one of those phosphates, and that releases energy. And if we had a mole of ATPs, it would release 7.3 kilocalories. And you'll notice that that's represented by a negative number. So this release of energy is represented by a negative number. We refer to this change in energy as the delta G, change in free energy, Gibbs free energy. And so anyway, that may seem a little counterintuitive, but what that is representing is that there's a certain amount of energy in the bonds of ATP, and if we look at the energy in the bonds of the phosphate and the ADP, there's less energy in those bonds than in the energy of ATP, so some energy is being lost to the surroundings, and that could be in various forms. Now, the opposite of an exergonic is an endergonic reaction. So endergonic reactions require energy, an input of energy. And so again, to make an ATP, you have to put energy into it. So an ADP plus phosphate then can be combined to form ATP. And that requires also 7.3 kilocalories of energy. And so energy-consuming reactions we describe as endergonic reactions. And those are represented with a positive number because the bonds afterwards have more energy than all of the chemical bonds before. So energy has entered this system. So as we look at an example here, let's say that we want to put two molecules together, glutamic acid and ammonia. Let's say we want to combine that to form glutamine, and let's say that that's going to require a certain amount of energy, 3.4 kilocalories, and there's an enzyme that wants to carry out that reaction. Well, if the enzyme wants to put those together, it has to get energy to do that work, and it's going to have to get that energy from the hydrolysis of ATP. So that enzyme would also bind and hydrolyze ATP, releasing 7.3 kilocalories of energy. But notice that it only requires 3.4 kilocalories to carry out the reaction. So what happens to the additional 3.9 kilocalories of energy? Well, that energy is lost to the surroundings as heat. So again, that's that second law of energy at work. As we work energy through this chemical system, some of that energy, in fact, a lot of that energy is lost to the surroundings as heat. So this is the thing about ATP. ATP can't control how much energy it releases. It's going to release 7.3 kilocalories. And even if you have a reaction, and this is just a hypothetical reaction, let's say we have a substance A and B that are going to form some substance C, and let's say that only requires 1/1000th of a kilocalorie, just a tiny amount of energy. Again, if the enzyme wants to do that work, it's going to have to get that from the hydrolysis of ATP, and that's going to release 7.3 kilocalories, which means in this case, 7.299 kilocalories is lost to the surroundings as heat. So again, ATP hydrolyzes, it's going to release all of that energy, and a lot of that energy is lost to the surroundings as heat energy. So as we look at nature is not really that efficient, but we'll come back to that in a second. Now, kind of previewing where we're headed then, so when we look at how ecosystems function, fortunately, even though nature is not that efficient, we essentially have a limitless supply of energy. That energy is coming from the sun. So the sun comes up every morning, it sets in the evening, but it's going to come up again. And so as we look at this diagram, you can see then that plants are what we call producers. They're going to be producing the food. So light energy is going to be used to construct organic molecules. And so what plants can do that we animals cannot do is that they can take inorganic molecules, carbon dioxide and water, and combine those into an organic molecule, glucose. That will release oxygen. But again, that is something that we animals can't do. We cannot take inorganic molecules and make organic molecules. Plants can. And so they'll be initially using solar energy, converting that to the energy in ATP, and then these organic molecules have energy which can be exploited by animals. And so animals then will eat the plants or eat one another and break apart those organic molecules to regenerate the carbon dioxide and water. And in the process, that generates ATP that can be used to carry out whatever chemical reactions we want to carry out. So plants then are producing the food, and so plants and organisms like them we describe as being producers. They're producing the food. And then those of us that cannot do that kind of work are the consumers, because we're consuming organic molecules. And again, plants can get their initial energy from light energy. They convert that actually to ATP, and then that energy gets trapped in the carbon-carbon bonds of organic molecules. Then we tear apart those organic molecules, regenerating them to be put back together again, but we will utilize that energy as ATP. And again, all along the way, energy is being lost to the surroundings as heat. So, you eat in the morning, that's not the last meal you're ever going to have because you can't recycle that energy. You're going to be losing that energy. So you have to eat again and eat again and eat again to keep replacing the energy that you lose. Now also, a couple of other terms, producers are also called autotrophs. There the word is saying that we're basically self-feeding, making your own food. And then the consumers are also called heterotrophs. So we're getting our food from other sources instead of making it ourselves. Now, as we look at this flow of energy through ecosystems, then at least in the Yellowstone ecosystem, most of the time we're talking about the sun as the source of energy. And that'll be kind of our typical situation here. There are some exceptions to this, but we're going to focus on the sun as being the primary source of energy. And so on the sun, there's a type of nuclear reaction which occurs there as opposed to a chemical reaction. Chemical reactions involve electrons, and we've talked about chemical reactions, ionic and covalent bonds. Nuclear reactions involve the nuclei. And so it's so hot on the sun that when isotopes of hydrogen collide with one another, instead of bouncing off one another, they actually fuse together to form helium, and that will also spit out an additional neutron. But when those nuclei fuse, it releases an extraordinary amount of energy. And this is the hallmark of a nuclear reaction, is that in that process, if we were to find the mass of the particles after the reaction, compare that to the mass of the particles before the reaction. The particles beforehand have a greater mass than those afterwards, and so there's a conversion of mass to energy, and that's the hallmark of a nuclear reaction. And so again, this is called a fusion reaction because nuclei are fusing to generate new elements, and this is how the elements in the solar system were formed. So anyway, that's going on in the sun right now. And so some of that energy that is released is electromagnetic energy or solar energy. So there is an electromagnetic spectrum. So electromagnetic energy is composed of very, very tiny particles called photons that move in a wave-like pattern. And so as we look at this wave-like movement then, the distance between the crest of one wave and the crest of another is known as the wavelength. And so as we look at this electromagnetic spectrum, there are gamma rays which have a very short wavelength, again, billionths, in some cases, or millions and billions of meters from the crest of one wave to another. Then X-rays, then ultraviolet rays, then the visible spectrum, and then infrared wavelengths are longer still, microwaves longer still, and radio waves would be the longest waves that reach the planet. And when we talk about ecosystems, really it's within this visible spectrum then that's energy is going to be absorbed. And so as we look at the visible spectrum, again on the short wavelength end we have purple, then blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. And so red has the longest wavelengths. So plants then are going to be absorbing energy in the yellow-orange spectrum primarily, as well as the purple-blue spectrum. So those are where plants tend to absorb energy. And so then that gets the energy into the food chain. And so plants then will carry out this process of photosynthesis, and they're going to do that in the chloroplast. And of course, the chloroplasts are organelles that plants have that animals don't. And I don't want to get into the details of this process, to be honest with you, but it's kind of a two-phase process. So as we look at the chloroplast, there's an outer membrane, there's an inner membrane, and the inner membrane is highly folded. You can see that these undulations of that inner membrane go back and forth. And so what occurs then within the chloroplast is photosynthesis. And as you can see, photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water, combines those to produce glucose, a sugar or an organic molecule, and in the process, oxygen is released as a byproduct. And again, this will consume energy. So this requires energy. It also requires a very extraordinary molecule, which is chlorophyll A. So chlorophyll A is absolutely required for this process to occur. And you can see it requires 686 kilocalories of energy to make one glucose. So as we look at photosynthesis then, there's kind of two sub-phases to this. One is the light reaction. And in the light reaction, solar energy is first converted to the energy in ATP. And again, this is going to be occurring within these thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast, these membranes that undulate back and forth. And so solar energy is converted first to chemical energy in the form of ATP in a very complex process that we won't be getting into in this class. And also that light reaction releases oxygen, and that forms the oxygen in our atmosphere. So I think that's something else to understand, is that the oxygen that we animals require is actually a product of photosynthesis. It's not a geological process, it's a biological process. And then there's a so-called dark reaction that does not require light, so-called light reaction or light-dependent reaction. Called the dark reaction or light-independent reaction. And here the organic molecules, carbon dioxide and hydrogens from water, will be combined to form the organic molecules. And this requires ATP as an energy source, and so that ATP is being generated in the light reaction of photosynthesis. And so in this dark reaction then, basically what happens first is there are three phases to this: fixation of carbon dioxide. What that means is that carbons from carbon dioxide are added to pre-existing organic molecules. Then glucose is generated from those carbons that come in, so it would require 6 carbon dioxides to make one glucose. And then that glucose is shuttled out of this system. And then the remaining organic molecules are reorganized to be able to accept more carbon. But basically, what's happening in the dark reaction is 6 carbons come in the form of carbon dioxide, 6 carbons go out in the form of glucose. And that process is going to require ATP. Obviously, carbon dioxide coming in, glucose will be going out. And then also that's going to require ATP from the light reaction to do that work. Okay, now, those organic molecules then are incorporated in the tissues of plants. And so animals then, consumers, will eat the plants for their organic molecules. And then what we do basically is take those organic molecules and rip them apart. We're going to consume glucose, combine that with the oxygen, regenerate carbon dioxide and water. And then that also then releases energy, 686 kilocalories of energy, and some of that energy will be in the form of ATP, and then the animals can use that ATP to do the business that we need to do. So in animals then, that cellular oxidation of glucose is going to occur in both the cytoplasm of the cell and also within the mitochondria. If we want to get maximum efficiency, we need mitochondria and we need oxygen. So again, it's also a two-step process. Basically, glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm outside of the mitochondria. And then for each glucose you start with, that'll generate 2 ATPs. But if you really want to get a lot of ATP, you have to be able to carry out cellular respiration. That occurs within the mitochondria of a cell, and that will generate an additional 34 to 36 ATPs. And again, that also requires oxygen. So that's really important to do. So again, that's the value of mitochondria. And so prokaryotes can't carry out this secondary process, and so they can only get 2 ATPs per glucose. So at the end of the process, then we have somewhere between 36 and 36 ATPs per glucose. Then we use those ATPs to carry out our enzymatic reactions. So again, producers make the food, consumers regenerate carbon dioxide and water, and then as long as energy is coming into the system and going out as heat, that drives the system. All right, so let's look at a food chain. Let's look at a food chain that we actually see up in Yellowstone, and we're going to begin with aspens. So there are a lot of aspens in the Yellowstone ecosystem. A lot of different animals will eat them. But aspens are a plant. They're absorbing solar energy. They're making the organic molecules. And so in this food chain, the aspen then would be a producer. And aspens then could be eaten by a beaver. Beavers happen to like aspens. They love aspens. They love cottonwoods. And so let's say in this case that the aspen leaves are eaten by a beaver. So the beaver then is a consumer. It's the first one in this food chain, so we call this one the beaver a primary consumer. So if you're the first consumer in the food chain, you're a primary consumer. So beaver then would be our primary consumer. Then let's say that a leech feeds on the blood of the beaver. And so in this food chain, the leech then is a secondary consumer. So it's the second consumer in our food chain. And so again, leeches are ectoparasites that we find in water. And then let's say that a cutthroat trout, living in the water after the leech feeds on the beaver, drops off. Let's say that a cutthroat trout eats the leech. It would be the tertiary consumer in this food chain. And then last but not least, let's say that a grizzly bear encounters that fish and eats that cutthroat trout. And so the grizzly bear in this food chain would be a quaternary consumer. And then it's possible, I don't know what would eat a grizzly bear, but perhaps a grizzly bear gets eaten by something. That would be a pentary consumer, and so on and so on. So this is an example of a food chain. So certainly molecules are transferring from one to another in a food chain, but energy is flowing from one to another in a food chain as well. And that's really our interest here today. So again, a grizzly bear would be our quaternary consumer here. So when we look at food chains also, generally, all of the consumers that are secondary consumers and above, we refer to those as higher order consumers. So sometimes you'll just see kind of summaries of food chains as producers, primary consumers, and higher order consumers. And also then, when we look at food chains in an ecosystem, certainly there's an overlap of many food chains. In other words, aspens aren't only eaten by beavers. Beavers are not only parasitized by leeches, but eaten by other animals. Wolves will get them when they can, so will coyotes and so on. So when you look at the entire Yellowstone ecosystem, all of these food chains are overlapping, so we describe this whole mass of food chains as the food web. So the food web in the Yellowstone ecosystem is quite complex, but it's actually pretty well understood, and so when we see changes in the ecosystem, we can predict the downstream effects. Some other terms also, herbivores refer to primary consumers. So herbivores are animals that eat vegetation. Carnivores would be higher order consumers, animals that are feeding on flesh. And omnivores are animals that can feed either as primary consumers or higher order consumers. And certainly humans fit into that category, but some other types of animals like grizzly bears, black bears also are omnivores. So, and coyotes as well. Coyotes are also would be another omnivore in this ecosystem. Some other terms that you don't really see so much with food chains, but I think are important to understand. Detritivores would be animals that feed on dead things. It could be dead vegetation or dead animals. Decomposers are microorganisms that feed on dead material. And then also symbionts. Symbionts would be where we have two different species interacting physically in some way. And again, this is something else that you don't normally see in a typical food chain, but which is very important in ecosystems, including the Yellowstone ecosystem. So in symbiotic relationships, there are three types of relationships that we see. Commensalism is where one species benefits and one is harmed. Or excuse me, one species benefits and one is neutral in the relationship. An example is that we have mites that live on our eyelashes. They benefit from that. It's a place to live, something to eat. We don't even know they're there, so we're kind of neutral in that relationship. So there are a lot of commensal mites and other organisms out there in nature. Mutualism, where both species benefit from the relationship. And again, in the Yellowstone ecosystem, deer, elk, bison, all of the large ungulates, moose, they feed on vegetation. They're feeding on cellulose. They cannot digest the cellulose. Animals lack the enzymes to digest cellulose. But living in their intestine are prokaryotic organisms and small eukaryotic organisms that can digest that cellulose. So this is a mutualistic relationship. The elk and deer and bison benefit from the relationship because they are getting food produced by the microorganisms. The microorganisms benefit because they have a warm place to live, they're protected, and the food is delivered to them. And again, those animals cannot survive literally if you were to sterilize their intestine. They require those organisms. And then parasitism is where one organism benefits from the relationship and the other is harmed. And parasitism is the basis of disease. And so when we look at parasites, some parasites we describe as ectoparasites. They'll live on the outside of organisms. And again, the leech we just talked about is an example of an ectoparasite. Endoparasites live internally, and we'll talk about some of these. There are parasitic worms and so on, which plague virtually all the animals in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And then as the host, if you're the one that's being parasitized, you're described as the host. And if you're an intermediate host, it means that there's a sexually immature parasite living in you or on you. If you're the definitive host, a sexually mature parasite is parasitizing you. And if you're the accidental host, you're not really the normal host. You just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and picked up something that normally wouldn't parasitize you. So again, this is something we'll talk about later in the semester, but parasites can really affect life in an ecosystem, including the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, the other thing I want to get back to again is kind of efficiency in nature. So when we look at organisms, again, if we take a caterpillar, for example, eating vegetation, a lot of the energy that it consumes is going to be just go out in the feces. Some of it will actually go into the tissues, and then a lot of it is lost to the surroundings as heat. So when we look at energy distribution in an ecosystem, in any ecosystem, most of the energy is found in the producer's tissue. So if we were to estimate all of the energy in the producer's tissue, we refer to that as the first trophic level. And then when you look at all of the primary consumers in the ecosystem and the amount of energy in their tissues, we could graphically represent that as the second trophic level. And then look at all of the energy in the secondary consumers and estimate their total biomass and energy in their tissues. That forms what we call the third trophic level in the ecosystem, and so on. And what I hope you notice is that only a fraction of the energy from one trophic level, what we call trophic levels or feeding levels in the food web, get to the next level. So there's tremendous inefficiency in food chains as we look at the food web in nature. Most of the energy is lost to the surroundings. So again, as we look at this energy pyramid, first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level, fourth trophic level, and beyond if there were other trophic levels, only a fraction of the energy is getting from one trophic level to the next. Only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level gets to the next trophic level. Again, second law of energy at work here, so that means that 90% of that energy is being lost to the surroundings as heat. And so, again, as we move through food chains, move through the food web, there's tremendous inefficiency. Only about 10% of the energy gets from one trophic level to the next. And we refer to this as the 10% rule. So this isn't something that's unique to the Yellowstone ecosystem. This is something that we see in all ecosystems, but again, that's the nature of ecosystems. So the only way that nature really functions in, and the reason that it continues to function with this inefficiency, is that we do for all effects, for all anything that matters, we have a limitless supply of energy available to us in the sun. It's going to come up every morning, bring us more energy. So again, that's the 10% rule of nature. So that can have some impact. For example, our own food supply. We can take our grain and feed it to our cattle and then eat it. That only means that we're going to get 1/100th of the energy that was originally in the grain. Or we could eat that food directly ourselves. And by moving down one step in the food chain, we can increase our food supply by 10 times. So that's something to consider. Now, the other thing I want to also look at is that there is energy value in different foodstuffs, and this is also really important to certain types of animals in the food chain, in the food web. When you look at carbohydrates, for example, carbohydrates have about 4 kilocalories per gram of carbohydrate. That's also true of proteins. Proteins have about 4 kilocalories per gram of protein. Now, when you compare that to lipids, lipids have 9 kilocalories per gram of lipids. So fatty material has much more energy per gram than do carbohydrates or proteins. And I've also thrown in ethyl alcohol. This isn't really a concern for the animals in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but you can see that it also has a lot of calories, 7 kilocalories per gram. So the significance of this is that animals then, especially in the Yellowstone ecosystem, long winter, short summers, they have to be very efficient in obtaining energy. You take the grizzly bear, and this is really an important thing for grizzly bear management, because with global warming, we're seeing lots of changes in the ecosystem. But grizzly bears, again, hibernate. They come out of hibernation, and they're voracious. And they, again, have to eat a lot. They have to gain a lot of weight, through the spring and summer. And it's not just the grizzly bears. Virtually all the organisms in the ecosystem need to do the same thing. They need to put on weight and put it on quickly. So again, if you're looking at grizzly bear management, grizzly bears do depend on some very lipid-rich foodstuffs. So for example, pine nuts are a big part of their diet later in the season as they get into the fall. And one of the real problems in the ecosystem is that the whitebark pine trees are dying. And this is a really fatty, nutritious food source for them. And one of the things we're concerned about is that those pine trees are expected to disappear in the next 30 years, and that's going to be a huge loss of energy to them. And even if they turn to other sources of energy, they may not have as many calories per gram. So it's a real management problem. So that's it for today. We'll continue our discussion next time.